Session 2 is entitled, But It's Supposed to Be Good News, Violent Texts in the Christian Testament. We look first at the nature of apocalyptic literature. This is a particular genre of literature in ancient Israel that arrived late in the history of the Hebrew Bible, was there during the period between the two testaments, and much of it appeared in the first century of the Christian era. Apocalyptic literature is produced in the heat and trauma of historical crisis. It describes the outcome of a battle as having cosmic implications and dimensions. A good example is Apocalyptic Daniel, written about 165 BCE, which covers chapters 7 to 12 of the book of Daniel. This is an early example of this type of literature. The purpose of the writer was to inspire hope in his oppressed Hebrew contemporaries by reminding them that no empire lasts forever, and although he portrays them as brutal beasts, they all have clay feet. Christian biblical literalists have interpreted the book of Daniel as predicting a kind of final showdown in history, somewhere in modern Israel, when Jews and Muslims will be wiped out and Christians alone will experience God's peaceful reign. An example of apocalyptic literature in the Christian Testament is the book of Revelation, the last book in the Bible, a book which has simultaneously fascinated and disturbed Christians. For the most part, the book has confused its readers, as it seems to use both violent and active non-violent images for God and Jesus. For example, Jesus is presented as a warrior king and at the same time as a non-violent lamb. Revelation also seems to contain a plethora of texts of violence, punishment and vengeance. And for this reason, some Christians have rejected the book. Martin Luther, for example, wished that Revelation had never been included in the canon. The book of Revelation, according to Walter Wink, is filled with a craving not for redemptive violence, but for something even worse, punitive violence, to be carried out by God, of course, so that John, the author, himself keeps his own hands clean. Or as Jack Nelson Palmeyer has put it, it is filled with so much blood and gore that one needs a thick skin to read it. Now, if all of this text is read and applied literally, then what we do have is the most violent book in the Bible, with some of the most violent images of God, and that is something which is disturbing. But apocalyptic literature gives readers a glimpse into the reality of the struggle with a historical domination system. We are not spared from descriptions of the superpowers' violence and oppression. This is what a superpower or an empire was really like. And we hear also the human longing and the cries for justice. How long, O Lord? At the same time, authentic apocalypticism reminds us that imperial rule is not ultimate, and that the only ultimate reality is the reign or the empire of God. Apocalyptic literature uses mythical language and symbols, and it's important to recognize the kind of language that it is using. It uses these mythical language and symbols to testify to an end of oppression, to new beginnings, to hope in God beyond the immediate crisis.
Let us explore Revelation as an example of fantasy literature. We tell stories to make sense of life. The storyteller is concerned more with the meaning of life than the facts of life. The Irish philosopher Richard Kearney writes that stories are what make our lives worth living. They are what make our condition human. Fantastic fiction provides a forum for raising important questions about the construction of reality and the values and belief systems that underpin our worldview. It often picks life as a journey in which good and evil forces struggle for control of the protagonist's soul. This is the predominant theme in Rowling's Harry Potter and Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. The basic theme of fantasy literature, then, is the use and abuse of power. It is for this reason that we can say, at root, fantasy literature is always political. The concern is with who should have the power to rule and on what terms. The expectation of readers of fantasy is that the mythical patterns that govern the universe will be adhered to. In other words, the universe will reward those who use power for the good of all and punish those who use power for their own ends. Of course, authors can play with this expectation and even subvert it. The Book of Revelation is a piece of fantasy literature. It's steeped in Greek and Hebrew archetypal images of good and evil that are woven into a cosmic story concerned with how political and spiritual identity is formed and how worship shapes allegiance. The story includes many of the elements found in fantasy literature, that is, supernatural characters, marvellous beasts, heavenly councils, epic battles between the forces of good and evil. The Book of Revelation, as religious fantasy, falls into the category of a quest story. The hero is Jesus Christ, and his quest is to expose this false imperial idolatry and ideology, the work of Satan, and by ways of the visions granted to John, defeat Satan, who is the source of evil, so that God's eternal city may be established on earth for all the faithful to dwell in. Revelation then unveils the true nature of God's power, not the violence of empire, but divine love symbolized by the slain lamb. The book's purpose is to expose the political idolatry in the first century Roman world that usurps true worship of God for false worship of empire, referred to as the beast. In the end, people are called to choose between allegiance to the beast, i.e. the empire, or allegiance to the Lamb, that is Jesus. Fantasy stories also often have a number of recurring motifs. The young questing hero who will grow up to rule the world with justice, the wise controlling sage or ancient of days who presides over the cosmos with power and splendour, irredeemably evil monsters that can take the form of a great dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns, and a damsel who gives birth to the hero and then needs rescuing from the dragon who pursues her. John of Patmos adheres to the principles of good storytelling in his composition of the book. The opening of the Book of Revelation foreshadows the ending, and in so doing it gives a sense of completeness. For instance, the Son of Man at the beginning has the first word. He also has the last word. He announces the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. The hero, Christ, and the villain, Satan, are identified early on, so the reader knows who to invest his or her emotional energy on. Good storytelling involves pointing up for the readers just what is at stake in the story. To truly engage the readers, they need to care about the final outcome. John makes it clear that the prize being fought for is the minds and hearts of all humanity, and because the stakes are high, the battle is fierce. Early on, the writer needs to make clear the setting for the story. The epic-like nature of Revelation demands a cosmic setting. The action therefore alternates between heaven and earth. A good storyteller also establishes the tone of the story, and this is what John of Patmos does very early on. Considering the subject matter and the high stakes, the tone in this book is both serious and urgent. A well-constructed story has a plot or story arc that builds on conflict, which increases in intensity toward a final resolution. As the conflict gains momentum, John uses powerful similes to create a vision of collapse on a cosmic scale. For instance, the sun becomes black as sackcloth, stars fall from the skies, a burning mountain is thrown into the sea, water turns to blood, and locusts with scorpion-like tails attack people. And finally, a good storyteller has a conclusion or climax that works best if at the end it reveals something that was implicit from the outset. This is often preceded by a series of epiphanies. The conclusion also has to be the final proof of the story's myth. In this case, a series of plagues precedes the final victory of good over evil, and these are intended to turn people back to God by exposing the ultimate weakness of the beast and breaking people's allegiance to it. The final chapters record the establishment of God's kingdom on earth, which has been hoped for from the book's outset. While fantasy literature is concerned with creating alternative worlds, it is certainly not escapist. Revelation is an example of fantasy literature which engages with real life and characters in a surrealistic way. Peter Hunt recognises this, and he underlines that fantasy literature tends to be moral in character, depicting the different natures of good and evil, and it is centrally concerned with viewing conduct in ethical terms. As we said at the start, the Bible is a book full of stories. The literary nature of the Bible and the fantastic elements in it enhance the biblical story, which testifies to God's presence in and involvement with our world from the first creation in Genesis to the new creation in the final book of Revelation. This does not mean, however, that the Bible is fantasy. What it does mean is that the Bible uses the conventions of fantasy to convey in story form profound truths about life and human experience.